Africa's triple challenge of poverty, inequality and unemployment has severe consequences for the economic, social and political conditions of the country. It makes education important as it not only enables individuals to earn and potentially earn an income, but also aids the country's value of human capital and those who can contribute to a skilled workforce. Well, we know that government is increasing its spending on education, that is higher education, year on year. But are we getting value for money? Well, joining us tonight to discuss this further, University South Africa Operations Head, Dr. Linda Meyer, Educational Consultant, Xolani Majola, and South African Union of Students National Organizer, Yandisa, Ndzoyiya. Good evening to all of you, and thank you for your time tonight on News at Prime. So we're sitting with a situation right now in the country where government is spending more than it ever has on funding higher education, which is really fantastic news given the state that many South African students would find themselves in and the context that they come from. On the other side of that, we're also sitting with the highest unemployment rate in the country. What does that say about the skills which we produce through institutions of higher learning, and why it is that the absorption rate into the labor market looks the way that it does? Dr. Meyer, let me begin with you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I think the critical element that we must just acknowledge is that although government is spending more in terms of rand value, there is a per capita decrease in terms of the spending per student across our institutions. The second important element is also to acknowledge that education cannot address and cannot be used as the pivot to address all other inadequacies in micro and macro economic policy frames. So we speak about why is the labor economy not absorbing the skills that are being produced? Well, first of all, the economy needs to produce the jobs. It's universities' jobs to ensure that the skills are available. But without economic growth, without stringent fiscal policy that creates an enabling business environment, we cannot have this discussion in isolation.
Dr. May, I just want you to break something down for me before I continue. So you say overall spending by government has increased, but spending per student has reduced. Is that across the board?
It is across the board, and this is because there is huge requirements on the system. So more and more students are wanting to take part in higher education studies. So be that in universities or TVET colleges, the demands on limited resources is really what is driving this. So we see that the Department of Higher Education and Training, I think their budget was around 108 billion. We see that NSFAS took about almost 47 billion of that. And the universities in South Africa, or the higher education system, got about an equal split of that. So we can see that as more and more students get access to the system, there's a limited pool of money that must be spread across the system to ensure that we enable as many students as possible to participate in the higher education system.
Mr. Majola, let me bring you in here and get your voice.
Look, I agree with Dr. Meyer, but as you know by now, I always want to look at a historical perspective. According to Stats SA, there is an article which they published in June 2021. They mentioned that education and prior work experience play an important role in the labor market, that employers often prefer those with previous work experience and a higher level of education. So what that says is that where you went to school and where you went to university, in our South African context, it does have a bearing in terms of your economic success, in terms of your access to job opportunities, because there is still a perception of poor quality offered by higher education institutions that were once or are predominantly black. which obviously has a historical implication, where higher education institutions in this country were actually divided according to racial lines. So that perception still carries on, because then what the historical disadvantage does is that it puts those graduates from these historically black higher education institutions at the back of the employment line, because they don't have the social capital, the networks, and access that privileged students have. So that dimension, in one way or the other, it does have a bearing in terms of opportunities that are out there. And the fact that there is now a majority of students being qualified, then what the labor market does is they seem to have more and more choices to pick only the best, and it disadvantages the rest. So for me, those historical nuances cannot go unnoticed. I think I'll stop there for now.
Sure. Yandisa, what does all of this mean, especially when we look at institutions such as your universities of technology, your FETs, given how much of the spending that government has, how much of that allocation ends up going into these institutions, and yet many of those graduates, if the research that Mr. Majola is talking about here tonight, stand to be disadvantaged.
Thank you very much for that. I think there are two things that I want to bring into the conversation firstly. Number one is the fact that we must analyze the symbiotic relationship between our education and employment, because I do not necessarily think that there's a space to absorb the graduates that we are producing, because there is generally in South Africa a low space is created for young people to be employed. Now, if you look closely into it, you look at part of the reasons that the industrialization of a country, that its economy is based on industries. That's the first point that you must look at, to say that the graduates that we are producing do not necessarily have space to absorb them in the labor market when they move. Second of all, we must then look at the value of the qualifications that we are producing. Are we producing the skills that are relevant to respond to the needs of the labor market? For an example, why is it that when every academic year, when we enroll students, we enroll about 400 HR students and we enroll about 40 pharmacist students? So it shows that probably somehow the skills that we are producing in these institutions are not responding to the labor market. Now, there are two things that we must then bring into summary. There's one term that Mr. Majola used that is very surprising and worrying, to say that a person is overqualified. I mean, in the labor market, a person is ought to be overqualified, because that's what you prepare yourself for as a student when you leave the institution of higher learning. You want to be competitive, so to some extent you might appear to be overqualified, but if there's enough space to absorb students and graduates into the labor market, there will not have been this crisis. Then this means that we must change how our economy is structured and how our economy looks into the issue of creating jobs. So it means that then when we fund education, which is good, our labor force is being educated, we must then create a process through industrialization that will absorb the graduates that we are producing in higher learning. I think that's where I'm going to stand for now.
All right, we're going to unfortunately have to leave it there. Our time has just flown by. We certainly needed to have allocated a lot more time to this conversation. Let me thank our guest, Dr. Linda Meyer with the University of South Africa, consultant Xolani Majola, and South National Organizer Yandisa Ndzoyiya.